I watched the first part last night, and it's a bit of a primer for those who haven't a clue really about the cartel and how it began, because it goes back to the very origins of Christy Kinahan, how he started and who he is.
It does, and I suppose this programme is actually made not only for an Irish audience but also for a UK audience who might not be familiar with that. They are probably familiar with the name Kinahan now, largely due to Daniel Kinahan's links into professional boxing and for other reasons, but they might not know the backstory. And really, like all stories, knowing where to start is always a conundrum, whether you're writing a book, creating a podcast, whatever it is. And usually, no matter how often you do it, the best place is usually the very beginning. And that's exactly what the programme makers have done. It brings us back to Dublin, to an ambitious young, middle-class guy with a lot of opportunities who watches Larry Dunn's demise and moves in to try and take over his role as the main heroin supplier.
And we shouldn't forget Larry Dunn's role in what I would regard as the demise of many of the inner city communities. I mean, he was, if you like, the most evil of them, because he started something. There was no heroin in Dublin. Maybe he saw it happening in other cities, how much money was to be made, but he introduced heroin to the capital, and it resulted in so many teenage deaths, so many deaths of siblings, families destroyed by Larry Dunn's work.
He did, and it was pure and utterly for greed, because he got a good deal on heroin because of what was happening in Iran. It was in supply in Europe. You could buy it cheaply, and he, could see the addiction of it and was actually pumping it into certain communities, often giving out the first fixes for free to children. So that really was, for sure, the beginning of the destruction of parts of Dublin and beyond.
Now, when we see the opportunism of Kinahan, he was a small-time kind of huckster, making money, bouncing checks and so on, and then he saw this opportunity. It didn't mean that he was home free, because he ended up in prison fairly early on in his drug dealing career.
Yeah, he was caught with heroin in Dublin. He's actually been in and out of prison quite a bit, Christy Kinahan. He kind of gets caught a little bit, but not, he's never got a massive sentence. I think he got 6 years here in Ireland. But of course, he went into prison, met with his later business partner, John Cunningham, who was one of the Jennifer Guinness kidnappers. And together, they decided they were getting out of here and they were going to become wholesalers. They moved to Amsterdam, where they began sort of the origins there of the global Kinahan cartel.
But it's extraordinary. He's in prison and he's offered an early release. This is Christy Kinahan. And he says, no, I'm studying for my Russian degree and my Spanish degree. So if I go out, I won't be able to study. It'll be very hard. There's so many distractions. So I'll stay in prison.
Yeah, and the other thing, it's not actually covered in that programme, but when he was going into prison, he told the judge that he was only dealing because he had a heroin addiction and he used the system to educate himself. So the taxpayer actually educated him. And many years later, when I was in Spain, where he had a very luxurious house, I remember just having a moment and looking at this property that he was living in and thinking, so many people go into prison, and it can be an opportunity for them to rehabilitate, to be educated, to come out and to become a better person. He used it to become, a major player on the global drug trafficking scene. And of course, he was learning Russian. Russian is standing to him now, because all these years later, the Kinahan organisation are dealing with Russian regimes, and they're working with them to transport drugs across the world and to launder money. And they probably would have a welcome in Russia should the United Arab Emirates ever decide to hand them back.
Now, in the programme itself, you actually mentioned that the implosion of the Kinahan Empire was actually beginning. When you look at it now, it doesn't seem to have imploded. I mean, they're still doing their business. They're still at liberty. No sign of them being, even though the Americans are after them big time, no sign of their demise.
Well, they've a few big problems, really. They have got the Americans been after them, which is probably their biggest problem. I would think of all places they'd nearly welcome coming back to Ireland rather than going to the States. Because if you get convicted there, that's it. Curtains. I mean, Joaquim El Chapo Guzman of the Sinaloa cartel, he's in a supermax prison, 23 hours a day locked up, and he ain't ever going to see the light of day again. And that's the way the American system works. So they have the Americans after them. We have, from Ireland, we have just signed an extradition agreement with the United Arab Emirates. There's an awful lot going on politically. And this story has actually become political. It's all political, bureaucratic tape now. But the fact of the matter is, they will be before a court, undoubtedly. Nobody sort of gets away with when they're, as Michael O'Sullivan actually says in the documentary, nobody, when you're on those posters, when your face is up there, you really are, properly wanted. And they have their freedom still, but how long more for? And they certainly aren't looking into the future of, a nice retirement. They will be pursued. And even if even if the Emirates continue to drag their heels as they have been with handing them back, even if they do move to Russia, they're very unwelcoming territories that they have left to go to. You know, there's the various suggestions that they might find sanctuary also in Iran, but they're not really going to be able to live that same lifestyle. And you do wonder how long they can stay. It always amazes me that they still have family here. They still have friends. That's still their home. And to be completely denied ever coming back or ever, walking your own land again it must be strange. But I suppose you need the personality in the first place to go into drug trafficking and get there.
Now, the first program covers the Regency murder, and it's now called the Bonington Hotel. So, that features the fact that there was a name change, and you can see why they would want to change the name. And it talks about the feud that happened between the Hutch family and the Kinahan family. I suppose started by which of them?
Well, it's like all sort of big organised crime groups. They usually do implode, and it's usually a mixture of jealousies, perhaps accusations of touting or of money going missing. It started because of a row between Gary Hutch and Daniel Kinahan. They were the glue that held those two groupings together, that really were together and formed the Kinahan cartel. And there's all sorts of stories goes on about where it started. I think really there was a little bit of jealousy in the mix. I think that Gary Hutch seems to have invested money into the cartel. He felt he wasn't getting it back quick enough. He felt he was owed money. But ultimately, at the same timeline, you see Daniel Kinahan, who was once his best friend, Hutch's best friend and equals, and you see him moving in a trajectory into the stratosphere, really, with all this. He is looking at becoming the most important figure in world boxing. And he's also looking at moving his father's, what he inherited from his father, this European cartel, onto the global stage. And I think he's so ambitious. There's no room for Gary Hutch on that pathway. And they just fell out. And Gary Hutch, or certainly the Hutch organisation, or associates of, made a number of attempts on Daniel Kinahan's life. The Regency would have been the third one. And, that was it. There was no going back after that. So, we saw what happened really in Dublin was very heavily affected by that for a number of years afterwards. 18 murders, most of them happened here. It's sort of faded away a little bit. Still those dangers are there for the protagonists and those involved, and they always will be. But as that all happened, the Kinahan organisation moved to the next level because they moved everything and physically out to Dubai.
Now, on the way, of course, they went to Amsterdam initially. Then we had southern Spain. The tentacles went into the UK, and now their resting place, if you like, is Dubai. To what extent is the money still rolling in?
Well, I mean, they're still shipping. They're still shipping. They're in a position that they're able to do deals and ship like enormous mother loads of cocaine across the world. So the money is undoubtedly still rolling in. Funny enough, you mentioned the UK. There's a very interesting, I think it's episode 3, and the program makers have access to some undercover surveillance, which was placed on Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, who was the UK operative of the Kinahan. He was almost a partner of Daniel Kinahan, and he has been taken down and taken out. But you're watching with the police the surveillance operations that are going on. And at one point, there's a guy called James Mulvey, who's a very significant player. He's eventually caught and jailed, but they're watching him. And it's a day when there's been a murder in Spain. One of the Kinahan crew has been taken out by his own, and he's talking about it. And this is a big, tough guy. Like, you really wouldn't want to mess with your man, James Mulvey. But he's terrified. You can hear the way he's talking. And that's really the power of the Kinahans. They terrified their own. So they kept the loyalties, and they were able to, it's almost nearly a cult-like structure at this stage. Nobody will go against them. They have beaten the systems a number of times. They've told people working with them that they will beat the systems. And when they do, they become more empowered and more powerful.
Well, it's an extraordinary story, unfolding week by week. If you missed episode 1, you can watch it next Tuesday, the 8th of April, on BBC One at 10:40 in the evening. And by the way, the Kinahan lawyers, the right of reply, they say, despite the programme makers' efforts, the Kinahan family did not engage in the making of the series, but a lawyer for the family said rumours and theories about them have not been tested in court, and a massive investigation by 5 countries ended with a dismissal of the main charges against them. What do you make of that?
Well, there's plenty of law enforcement authorities around the world, including our own, ready to test them in court, I can tell you.
All right. Thank you very much for Nicola Tallant, investigations editor of the Sunday World, author, producer, podcaster, and someone who features extensively in this series. Nicola, thank you very much.